Hello, and welcome back to Warhammer Ignorant Armies. This week we will be reading The Starboat by Steve Baxter. And there's some crazy demonic artwork, as is common in the Warhammer universe. So let's begin. You're drinking alone, the stranger's voice rasped against the friendly hubbub of the tavern. Eric lowered his tankard and thought it over. Between campaigns, Eric, the one they called Eric the Were, always drank alone. Everyone knew that. So who was this? He had made enough enemies on his many campaigns. Had one found him now? The weight of his battle-hardened axe pressed against his thigh. He turned slowly, wiping froth from his mustache. A rich purple cloak swaddled the stranger. No face could be seen in the hood's shadows. The stranger stood utterly still, like a lizard. Eric wrapped the thin wrist in one hand. The stranger spat like a snake and snatched back his arm. Beneath its covering, the flesh had been cold. I mean no offense. Trembling, the stranger sat on a precarious stool opposite Eric. He had no drink, and he kept his hood over his head. I know of you, he hissed, breathing hard. You are Eric. Mercenary. A fighter whose fame passes far beyond your forsaken Norska. Eric caught a glimpse of yellow eyes deep inside the hood. You have just returned from Araby? Yeah. So? The stranger shrugged. He indicated the rest of the tavern. Half-armored Norsemen waving money at serving women. I can see it was a rewarding trip, the stranger said dryly. But you're not a man to throw money around, are you? Eric remembered Araby. The sunlight stamped down on fire-hot sand, scalding the blond bodies of the Norsemen. He stood ready with the Ulfwerenar, the Wolfkin. The werewolf warriors howled their discomfort. The metal of his sword burned in his hand. He closed with Arabs whose breath stank of spices and who fought with knives clutched in long teeth. A growl built deep in his throat, and he felt his lips stretch around a thrusting jaw. A red mist covered the sun, and his teeth sank into dark flesh. Eric the Were. His breath rattled in his throat. The stranger was watching him. He forced himself to relax, to loose his grip on his tankard. I risk my life for my pay. Why throw it at some fat barman? Very admirable. Raucous singing drifted through the crowd. Ah, the stranger cocked his head. I'm no expert on your aboriginal music, but I can make out the sentiments. Companionship, the bond of death. Again the shadowed head swiveled at Eric. And where are your companions, Eric? Eric worked his hand around his tankard. I choose my own company, he growled. Really? The stranger leaned closer. His sibilant hiss turned to a whisper. You see, I know why they call you the Were. You have a trace of the Ulfwerenar in your veins, but your blood is not pure. You are both wolf and man, but you are neither wolf nor man, are you? So? I've seen your type before. The wolf in you makes you a formidable warrior, the little you dare release, but you are a warrior wary of himself. Eh, Eric? And none of your comrades in arms, human or Were, see you as one of their own. Do they, man Were? How many of them will drink with you now? Is your wolf blood a gift or curse, Eric? Eric slammed one fist on the tabletop. Heads turned. When they met his glare, they turned away. What do you want? My name is Kutza, the stranger stood. I traveled here to find you. I have an assignment for you. A challenge for the great and courageous Eric the Were. A journey to the northern wastes. A search for ancient treasure. I have a room in the tavern called the Dragon's Tooth. Come at dawn. Kotza reached into a deep pocket and threw a handful of coins onto the table. Here, he said. Until then, drink and forget your loneliness, man Were. And he turned and strode out of the tavern, his gait awkward and rolling. With a snarl of disgust, Eric brushed the coins onto the floor. A little before dawn, Eric settled his account and left the tavern, his breath frosting over his beard. He walked through Ragnar's deserted streets. At the edge of the little town, he climbed a small rise. Pine-clad mountains swept down from behind Eric and pushed ridged fingers into the sea. The stars began to die, frost glistened. The lights of Ragnar and a dozen other small towns glittered in the fjords. Mist covered the sea, and the mournful sound of a longboat's dragon horn floated out of the fog. Grumbling voices drifted up to him out of Ragnar. The house of the Husting, the town council, shouldered its way above the mass of squat buildings, its bell tolling the hour. It was all very ordinary, human, comforting. Eric shivered and turned away and looked north. Darkness clung like smoke to the northern earth, oblivious to the dawn. Far to the north lay the great waste. It was a land of night. That lingering dark was the banner of the chaos powers. Something in him stirred. He touched the mat of fur that covered his upper cheek. The cloaked stranger's words carried truth. Eric was a solitary man. Others could sense the seeds of chaos in him. The traces were of were-blood, even when the physical signs went unnoticed. He remembered a child goaded day after day by his fellows, a child who wasn't like the others, a child who was thick-set, hirsute. A child had never dared to do what he longed to do, to howl and bark and bite into the throats of his tormentors. For what if the wolf refused to subside? What if the wolf overcame the little boy and trapped him somewhere inside? Eric the Were, a child terrified of himself. The stranger had seen into his most secret heart. Eric felt exposed, weakened. Anger coursed through his thoughts. He pulled his cloak tighter around him and stalked back into town. He rapped at the door of the Dragon's Tooth. The innkeeper was fat and bald. He grumbled as he led Eric up to Kotza's room. Eric pushed open the door. There was no bed in the room. A large iron bath held water that steamed in the draught from the door. A massive trunk stood open in one corner. On a table was a plate. On a table, a plate was stacked with damp greenery. It looked like seaweed. The dish was garnished with the mashed up remains of insects. Kotza stood motionless in the center of the room, facing Eric. He still wore his purple cloak. "What are you, Kotza?" Kotza nodded, the hood's shadow falling over his chest. "I expected you." "No more games," Eric strode towards him. Kotza raised thin arms. Eric brushed them aside and grabbed handfuls of cloak. The material was rich and thick, but it parted easily. Kotza cried out. It sounded like a child weeping. The remnants of the cloak fell away, and Eric stood back and stared. Kotza resembled a toad stretched upright to stand like a man. His face was mottled, his mouth wide. A white throat bulged, eyelids like plates slid across yellow eyes. He wore a suit of something like rubber. Fine pipes embedded in the suit were wrapped around Kotza's limbs and torsos. From one pipe, water was leaking. Blue feathers protruded from the neck of the suit, and china blue tattoos covered in webbed hands. The great mouth opened, and a forked tongue flickered. "You are satisfied, strong man?" "You're a slan." Eric felt numb, unable to react. Kotza bent to pick up his torn cloak. Eric saw how his legs hinged outwards like a frog's. "Obviously I'm a slan, but not just a slan." He stroked the feathers around his neck. "I was once an eagle warrior, high rank too." He waved Eric to a chair and walked awkwardly to the door, pushed it shut. As he moved, Eric saw how the rubber suit showered his face and neck with water. Eric sat. "But slan never leave Lustria." "Of course not. How bright you are this morning." The slan limped to the table and picked up the plate of food. He waved it at Eric. "Breakfast?" Eric eyed the insects. "No." The slan's tongue wrapped like a fist around particles of food. Kotza kept talking as he ate, the words coming from the back of his mouth. "There's no such word as never, my friend. But it is true that the slan hardly ever travel. It's such a fuss." He waved a webbed thumb at the bath and the rubber He waved a webbed thumb at the bath, the rubber suit. You may know we're amphibians. The word meant nothing to Eric. I need to be warm and wet, said Kotza impatiently. Your damn country is cold and dry, so I have to carry my own warmth and wetness. The tongue flicked at the insects, and you've no idea how hard it is for me to get decent service in these taverns. What do you want from me, Kotza? Ah, the man of action. Straight to the point, eh? What do you know of the Slann? Eric shrugged. What I need to know. Which is how to kill them with the least effort, I imagine. The Slann pushed aside his plate and patted delicately at his lips. Eric, let me tell you about the Slann. We are the world's oldest race. Some legends say we built the world, and others besides. We traveled between our worlds in great ships, like longboats among the stars. Do you understand? I understand you're telling me children's stories. Kotza rolled huge yellow eyes. Try to let me penetrate your ignorance, Norseman. Our star boats traveled by passing through warp gates. There was a warp gate on this world, far to the north of Norska, but on the other side of the warp gates was a strange ocean, an ocean ridden with chaos. The boats sailed the sea to the stars, you see, and chaos, filled their sails. One day the ocean broke from our control. Contact with other worlds was lost. Those gates became centers of instability and horror. We Slann retreated to Lustria and degenerated into the barbarism we endure today. Eric removed his horn cap, loosened his furs in the steam-laden air. How do you know this? Legends. The Slann have tales of the past, garbled of course, and so do the elves. Kotza's frog face split into a wide grin, legs bent, throat working. He looked more toad-like than ever. There are many legends, and they fit together like the pieces of a shattered plate. Do you understand? Far to the north of here, across the Sea of Darkness, lies the Lost Warp Gate. It is the center of a region so damaged that no material thing can survive. And around that, in turn, lie the Chaos Wastes. Now, we will have to penetrate the fringes of the waste, travel to places no mortal has seen in hundreds of years. Eric reached out and grabbed one skinny shoulder. Slow down, Slann. What are you talking about? The Slann hissed, nodding. My apologies. I will explain, please. Eric relaxed his grip. Kotza rubbed his flesh. Why venture to such a place? I will tell you. The elves have a story. They were the great days of the Slann. The Warp Gate was an arch 10 miles high, constructed of the finest obsidian. It loomed over the frozen pole of the world and turned with the planet. It was the heart of a glittering city. There were stars inside the gate. Slann traders passed through the gate in their star boats to 1,000,000 worlds. 100 races mingled in the gateway city. One day, fire billowed out of the gate. Death and destruction reigned over the gateway city. Cubic miles of ice turned to slush. Now a landing craft came lurching out of the gate, damaged in some unknowable accident. It trailed fire. It flew hundreds of miles before plowing into the ground. There were no survivors. The Slann cordoned off the area. The wrecked starboat sank, hissing into melted ice. Slowly, the ice froze over. The city was rebuilt. Gradually, over centuries, the incident was forgotten. Eric thought it over. He traveled in longboat convoys to the New World often enough to pick up a little navigator's lore. Yes, the world was round, and it turned like a top around a spindle somewhere to the north. But other worlds? Starboats? He stood, gathering up his armored cap. I've told you, Slann. I've no need to hear your children's tales. Kotza hissed. Of course not, since no human woman is likely to bear you children of your own. Is that right, Wereman? Eric turned his back and walked to the door. You see, Kotza said, the wrecked boat flew far enough south to leave it close enough to reach. It is only a few hundred miles north of here, across the Sea of Darkness, on the ragged edge of the wastes. I intend to find that crashed Slann boat, and I want you to come with me. Eric hesitated, turned. No mortal creature has ever traveled so far and survived. Kotza smiled. No mortals have taken the precautions we will take. He looked at the Norseman intently. Well, Eric? Will you join me? Eric shook his head. I will not throw away my life for a Slaan's dreams. Kotza opened his mouth wide. Ah, but what dreams do you have, Eric? Are they human or where? Listen to me. There is nothing for you here. It will be a great adventure. Perhaps we will start a few legends ourselves. Eric grinned. Of course, there is one small problem. What? How will you find this starboat? The wastes are large. The Slaan nodded rapidly. There is a way. The old Slaan made a map showing the wreckage. It was drawn on an indestructible parchment. The map survived the fall of the Slaan. It has become a priceless artifact. Eric's interest stirred. You are moving from fable to fact, Slaan. Show me the map. Kotza grinned, throat wobbling. I don't have it. I've never even seen it. Then how? But I know where it is. And I want you to steal it for me. Here. The Slaan scuttled to his trunk. He rummaged through a disorderly pile of cloaks, spare pipe suits, and food parcels. He drew out a small leather purse, spilled it on the floor before the Norseman. Eric looked down. Gold coins, scores of them. They bore a scowling frog visage. The face of Mazdamundi, lord of all the waters of the world pond, said Kotza. Call this an advance against unimaginable wealth to come. Eric looked up and studied the grinning Slaan. Where? Kotza hissed in satisfaction. Have you ever visited Kislev? Eric knew Kislev. Kislev is in the chill north of the old world. Its great cities, Urskoy, Prague, the seaport of Erengrad, stand on rivers that drain a continent. Kislev's fortune is its trade. Its curse is its location. For Kislev is a buffer between the old world and the servants of chaos who roam the wastes to the north. 200 years ago, said Kotza, there was an incursion of chaos. Thousands of lives were lost. Prague was laid to waste, but at last the champions of chaos were put to flight. In one famous victory, the governor of the port of Erengrad defeated a chaos prince, seized his booty. Among the grisly trophies, the severed limbs, the skull fragments, the governor's men found a treasure. It was a map, printed on an indestructible parchment. What Eric needed was a way to get to Erengrad. He found a small whaling boat in Ragnar Harbor. Its timbers were stained with blood. A necklace of shark teeth draped the crude dragon's head at its prow. The corpse of a whale bumped against the hull. Eric found the boat's master in a tavern. He was a fat, cheerful Norseman called Bjorn. Over a couple of tankards, bought with Slaan money, Bjorn told Eric tales of how the boat worked the Great Western Ocean. Now it was on its way to Erengrad to sell its latest catch. Over more tankards, Eric talked his way into a berth. The lights of Ragnar disappeared into the freezing fog. Bjorn handed Eric a bone-handled knife. This is a whaler, he growled. Not a dem pleasure yacht. Eric sighed and stripped off his furs. There were 20 Norsemen in the crew, all broad and well-muscled. They plastered grease over their faces and hands to keep out the chill winds, and with Eric sliced their way into the carcass of the whale. On the evening of the 10th day, Bjorn grabbed Eric's shoulder. Eric was flensing a man-sized slab of meat. Whale epidermis lay at his feet like discarded clothes. He straightened up the muscles of his shoulder, aching as they never had before. He was coated with blood and bits of blubber. Bjorn pointed. Erengrad, he said. We'll dock soon. Eric grinned at Bjorn, feeling dried blood crackle over his face. Thanks. Bjorn snorted and clapped Eric's back with one huge hand. Listen, you earned your passage. If you ever need a job, find me. I need to clean up. Bjorn shrugged. And dip a bucket of water over the side. The water's fresh here. We're already in the mouth of the Linsk. Erengrad spread around the mouth of its river. Shadowed hills cupped the city to the north. In the gathering twilight, Eric could see coach lights gleaming from onion-shaped cupolas. An island sat like a mile-wide toad in the river mouth. It bristled with docks, a broad bridge arched from the island to the mainland. The bridge stood on wooden piles wider than a man's height. The whaling boat nuzzled against one of the piles. Eric saw tough wood coated with seaweed and barnacles. A ladder of rusty iron was stapled to the pile. Eric and the rest of the crew filed up the ladder to the bridge's road surface. Then, grinning with anticipation, they made their way onward. Oh, it's a typo. They made their way towards the city. Carts and coaches of all kinds crowded the bridge. The air was thick with scents of horses, tar, fish, freshly cut timber, with the babble of a dozen tongues. A party of merchants clattered past on a truck piled high with casks of wine and oil. Their sing-song voices drifted over the hubbub. White teeth flashed in darkness. Estalians, Bjorn said, pointing. From Magritta, maybe? Bjorn, when do you leave? After a day and a night, Bjorn growled. At dawn, long enough to unload and get our credit. You coming? Don't wait for me. Bjorn nodded, showing no curiosity then. With a backward grin, he melted into the evening crowd. Eric spent the night quietly, attracting no attention. He hired a room, ate, and slept, kept his mind a blank. The following afternoon, he took a walk through the bustling heart of Erengrad. Temple towers loomed over the streets of low government buildings. Pale lawyers, clerics, civil servants eyed him curiously. The palace of the city governor was a jumble of cupolas and minarets. Effete? Eric decided. It was surrounded by a wall of granite twice Eric's height. He eyed it speculatively. Then he went to his room. Dawn had already touched the sky when he arose. The whaler was due to leave very soon. He imagined the crew drifting out of the taverns, rubbing their eyes and gathering their furs. He tied a thong of leather around his waist, pushed into his heavy iron axe and his short sword of beaten bronze. Then he slipped out of the room. A dozen campaigns had taught Eric how to move his bulk in silence. Now he moved like a shadow through the sleeping streets of Erengrad. He approached the governor's palace from its darker side, the western. Outside the palace wall he waited, a dozen precious breaths, no movement, only the peal of a bell. Then he scrambled up and over the wall, fingers digging into crevices in the granite. He landed softly and hurried into shadow. He was in a rich garden. Loamy flower beds were crisscrossed by gravel paths. The palace itself sat in the heart of the greenery. It looked like a sweetmeat in fancy wrapping, Eric thought in disgust. Light crept higher into the sky. More bells tolled somewhere outside. There were no guards. Nothing moved. Eric walked over the silent soil of a flower bed to the palace. The doors were squat and massive, but there was a window, at head height, protected only by an iron grill. A moment with the blade of his axe and the grill scraped free. He lowered the grill into a spray of flowers and put his hands on the window edge. A footstep like thunder, a growl like a shout in a tavern, a breath on his neck, damp and stinking, careless. He whirled, reaching for his sword. It was a giant, at least 3 times Eric's height. The giant thumped a chest the size of a small room. His huge belly was swathed with the skin of 3 oxen. 3 boneless ox heads dangled from his hip, mouths gaping. The giant bent over Eric and thrust forward a moon-like face. Eric peered into filthy nostrils that were wider than his fist. The great mouth opened in pleasure, revealing teeth like flagstones. The giant clapped huge hands together, pinning Eric's arms to his sides. Eric felt his ribs grind, his lungs strain. He gripped to the handle of his axe with his fingers that pounded with trapped blood. Think, he told himself. Use his strength against him. The giant grunted and squeezed harder. Silently, Eric called to his wereblood. His jaw ached as if growing. The muscles of his back grew supple and strong. He fixed his eyes on a particularly corroded tooth, then he arched his spine backwards, lifted both feet, and slammed his heels into the base of the tooth. The giant stared, as if puzzled. Eric kicked again and again, enamel crushed beneath his feet. At last, pain found its way to the giant's brain. He roared. Eric's skull rattled. The huge fingers relaxed, just slightly. The giant began to straighten up. Eric braced his feet against a stubble-thick chin and shoved as hard as he could. He flew backwards out of the giant's grasp. He wrapped his arms about his head before he could hit the palace wall, but as he'd intended, he passed with a bump through the window frame and rolled into the palace. He landed on his back in a darkened room. A hand like a side of beef crashed through the window after him. Carpet roll fingers wriggled. The giant bellowed in frustration. Eric pushed himself to his feet, ribs grating, and scuttled away from the window. Then he stood stock still, eyes closed, blood rushing in his ears. Gradually the wear subsided. When his thoughts had cleared of their red tinge, he hurried into a corridor. Widely spaced lanterns cast pools of light. He heard raised voices, the clatter of footsteps. He grinned into the darkness. He hefted the axe in his hand. He had maybe seconds. Working by instinct, he ran through the rambling corridors. He came to a carved doorway, gold handle. A human guard who stared at him with wide, startled eyes. A single blow to the windpipe. The man fell unconscious and silent. There was an ornate lock, a thrust of Eric's shoulder, and he was in the room. The governor was dressed. He sat calmly on the edge of his bed, a small, portly, middle-aged man. "I heard the commotion. I've been expecting you, Norseman." Eric stared wildly around the walls. "Was the map here?" "I have a network of ears," the little man said mildly. Strands of Norse blonde hair lay over his bare scalp. "I need to know, you see, and there is a whaling crew in town who have been bragging about a mysterious Norseman who buys ale with Slan gold." There, in a gold frame, a parchment of china blue, there was a thick red line that looked like the coast of Norska. A drumbeat of running footsteps. There was no more time. Eric smashed the frame with a blow of his axe, pulled out the parchment, and thrust it into his tunic. "Norseman," the governor snapped, "do you know what you're stealing? That map is a trophy of our victory over the incursion, a memorial to thousands of lost human lives." Despite his urgency, Eric hesitated. "So? Give it to your Slan master and you betray your race." Eric stared at the serious, brave little man. He remembered the seductive words of Kotza. "Outcast, neither man nor were." "What is your loyalty, Eric?" Eric spat onto the governor's thick carpet. Then he turned and ran out of the room. A party of soldiers to his left. Eric ran right. Booted feet pounding on carpet. He came to a kind of crossroads. He paused. The chasing party was closing, waving polished swords, and ahead there was another troop. They saw him and began to run at him. Eric waited, let them rattle so close he could feel the drop from their waved swords, then ducked to the right. The two parties clattered into each other in a jumble of swords and ornate helmets. He came to a window, kicked out the grill, somersaulted to the garden below. He was in a battered flower bed. The sky was light enough to show traces of blue. The giant lurched towards him, one finger probing at a bloody tooth. Eric saluted him. Then he sprinted the wall and took it in a single vault. He ran across the bridge, dodging early traffic. Breath rasped in his lungs. He risked a look back. Soldiers filled the bridge like a thick fluid. They shouted threats and shoved aside cowering traitors. The little whaling boat had already cast off. It was about 20 paces away from the quay. The quay? The crew, swearing and bleary-eyed, hauled at rigging. Bjorn saw him and waved. Eric didn't slow. He sailed off the bridge and smashed into the water a body's length short of the boat. 2 quick strokes and the grinning Norsemen were hauling him over the side. Soldiers gathered on the bridge. Spears and arrows sailed over the boat and plopped into the water. The Norsemen fished them out and flew and threw them back, spitting insults at the Kislevites. Eric lay in the bottom of the pond, panting. Smell of whale blood was like a welcome home. Bjorn stood over him, mouth twisted in amusement. Eric made to speak, but Bjorn waved him silence. Tell me later. Haul on this. We've got work to do. And he handed Eric a rope. Eric sighed and struggled to his feet. On his return to Ragnar, Eric made for Kotza's lodging. Now, the Slan hissed. Now we begin. He drooled over the map, black tongue wriggling. Eric watched for a moment, flesh crawling at the reptilian strangeness of the Slan, remembering the Erengrad governor's accusation of betrayal. Suddenly, he was disgusted with himself. He turned to leave. Kotza rasped. Wait! Norseman, where are you going? You have your map. I've been paid. That's it. Slan walked up to him, pasted feathers rustling. But I want you to travel with me. Follow this map. Find the ancient treasure. Venture into the wastes for an idle frog dream? Kotza showed no reaction to the insult. He said smoothly, I offer you riches. You offer me death. The Slan stared into his eyes, white throat working. I offer you salvation, Eric. A way to face the wastes. A way to face yourself. Are you afraid of that? Anger and disgust boiled in Eric, his fists bunched. The Slan stepped back rapidly. Eric breathed hard, tried to remain composed. Kotza, he spat, I fought with the Slan. You're like no Slan I've ever heard of. Slan are ritualistic, governed by arcane practices. For a Slan, there is no looting, no individual glory. But you're greedy, ambitious, selfish, grasping, devious. Eric barked contemptuous laughter. Almost human. What are you, Kotza? Kotza shook his wide head impatiently. Must all Slan be alike? Are all humans alike? How little of the world you have seen, Norseman. How little you understand. Eric studied the quivering Slan for a few more seconds, then turned once more. Goodbye, Kotza. Norseman, I leave Ragnar in 6 days. Remember my offer. Another murky dawn broke over Ragnar. Eric left his lodgings, holding his furs closed against the chill. He walked through frosted sheets towards the harbor. Ragnar was unusually busy. Lights shone already in the hustings. Carts clattered along the cobbled roads, grease lanterns making arcs of light in the darkness. Mist billowed from the nostrils of horses. Eric reached the harbor. All along the waterfront, metal clanged, wood thumped, and men swore. Light moved over a row of 10 longboats. Today, Kotza was leaving for the north, and he was creating quite a spectacle. Eric walked along the rough harbor wall and stood over a longboat and its crew, relishing the familiar sight of their preparation for a departure. The boat was at least 50 paces long. It rode high in the brisk waves. As it pitched, Eric could see water streaming off the boat's overlapping timbers. Strands of seaweed clung to iron bolts with heads as big as his fist. A forest of oars now sprouted from the boat's sides. Shouting sailors dipped them into the gray water. The light caught the boat's dragon prow. The wooden beast stared into the sea. A team of mighty war horses, towering over their human handlers, was led onto one boat. The handler's overseer was a bluff, plump Norseman. He cursed his men continually. He turned at Eric's approach. Bjorn. The big Norseman grinned and clapped Eric's shoulder. Ah, my mysterious friend. You were joining our crazy voyage with the Frogman? I don't know yet, Eric admitted. But if I do, I'll be glad you're there. Bjorn shook his hand and returned to his work. The sky brightened and the square sails of the boat were furled and unfurled. The sails all bore a brilliant sun symbol, the emblem of the Emperor Mazdamundi. A voice hissed behind Eric, the ruler of the sun, shining over these frozen barbarians. Eric turned. Kotza stood there in a fresh cloak of purple. He tossed back the hood to reveal a wide grin. Jets around his neck sprang mist into his face. Why the horses? You will see when we land on the coast of the waste. The Slan pulled his hood over his head and walked along the harbor wall. Then he stopped, turned his face to Eric, waiting. Eric glanced toward Ragnar, his mind awhirl. Not one person on all this stretch of coast, he reflected, would wonder where he was this morning. None would miss him. Chaos, Kotza whispered. It's in your blood, Eric. Face it, man. You have no choice. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Eric walked after him. The convoy of longboats pushed cautiously through the ice floes. The fur-clad Norse sailors respectfully mucked out the war horses, shifted and lashed the tons of cargo. They laughed, joshed, and wrestled each other. For the first few days, Bjorn's tongue was rarely idle. But as they moved further north, the men grew subdued. A sheet of darkness fluttered like a flag across the northern sky. Even at noon, it was a constant reminder of their destination, and many a blonde head turned to that mysterious gloom. They made landfall on a beach crisp with ice. Eric clambered into the water with the rest. The cold stabbed through the wool and fur that swathed his legs. Swearing, the Norsemen hauled their longboats high up the beach. The war horses clattered through the wavelets, snorting, utterly fearless. The coast was a sheet of barren rock. The wall of darkness loomed over the breach, dwarfing the tiny Norse camp. Using their war axes, the Norse broke up one of the longboats and built a series of fires. The flames cast little puddles of light into the hostile darkness. That first night, Kotza let them break open a cask of mead, and the foreign shore rang with songs of the Norse warrior gods. But despite the drink, few slept easy. The next morning, Kotza began to reveal his plan. First, sweating workers carried bricks from the longboats and began to construct a crude smelting oven. Then some yards away, another longboat was taken apart and the fat timbers of its keel laid out in a rectangle about 20 paces long. Eric worked with the rest as a framework twice as tall as a man was erected over the rectangle. Kotza stalked about the site, his flat face poking out from under a woolen cap. His jaw was wreathed in steam. He pointed and hissed instructions to the cursing Norsemen. After some hours, he let the men take a break and began patrolling around the hut like construction, poking and pulling at joints. At last he seemed satisfied and stood back. Eric walked up to him. You are constructing an elegant little house, Slan. What do you intend to do? Grow flowers in the ice? The Slan spread his mouth wide in his parody of a grin. The best is to come, my friend. You are a fighting man. There's a battle formation called the Turtle. Do you know of it? Memories returned to Eric of a dozen men huddled under a carapace of upheld shields, cutting their way into an enemy horde. Yes, I know the Turtle. Well then, this hut is to be our turtle. We will ride inside its shell into the mouth of darkness, all the way to the star treasure. Now, the armor. He clapped his gloved hands. Grumbling, the Norsemen got to their feet and began hauling metal plates from the longboats. Kotza brought a sample of the armor to Eric. It was a helmet. The Norseman turned it over in his hands. It had a luster like old silver. Mithril armor, hissed Kotza. I know what it is. I've seen it. Never held a piece before. Too damn expensive. Kotza hauled his coat higher around his neck. Mined by the dwarves of the smith city of Zufbar. Too hard to work, except by magical means. Eric handed back the helmet. So they say. And shot through with charms against the powers of darkness. And on this legend, you're going to gamble our lives? Kotza did not reply. Steam puffed from his slit nostrils. Eric turned. The pile of unloaded armor had grown taller than a man. I'll say one thing, Slan. You're not short of resources. As you say, Eric, I am gambling my life. I have no interest in economy. Now Kotza's design became clear. Under the Slan's direction, the Norsemen began to plate the armor over the structure. The mithril was too hard to work or pierce, so they used huge iron clips to staple it to the wood. The smiths carried ladles of iron from their oven. They poured the iron like toffee into the gaps between the armor plates. Metal dripped into the ground, snow flashed to steam, snow was packed over the cooling joints. Then the smiths beat at the hardened metal with massive hammers. Walls of metal began to build up, shining softly in the low polar sunlight. Even the floor of the turtle was lined with armor. The labor continued for a day and a night. Eric touched one twinkling wall. The armor had retained its curved forms. Here he could recognize a chest plate. There, a broad helmet pushing out of its surface. It gave the plating a crusted look, oddly reminiscent of a real turtle shell. He stood there, pulling at his mustache. Then he stepped inside the turtle and began kicking at the mithril plates. Iron seals cracked and the plates tumbled to the snow. The Norseman stood back and watched, bemused. Kotsa came stamping into the turtle. "Norseman, what in the name of the Underlight do you think you're doing?" Panting, Eric faced the Slan. "I'm saving your life, frog. By kicking apart my turtle?" Eric bent and picked up a back plate. A rough rim of iron clung to it. "Mithril armor might stop the assaults of the powers, but this pig iron certainly won't." Kotsa stared at him, his throat working. "Then what do you suggest?" he rasped. "Clinker build." "What?" "Overlap the mithril armor, as we overlap the planks that make up a longboat's hull. Caulk it with iron as we caulk our boats with animal hair. Then you will be surrounded by an unbroken shell of mithril." For long seconds, Kotsa's breath sawed through his nostrils. Then he turned and stamped out of the turtle. He summoned Bjorn. "Do as he says." When all but one wall of the turtle had been finished, the war horses were led in. They were divided into 2 teams of 6 and were made to stand on twin belts of thick leather. The belts were crusted with strips of mithril, and they passed in continuous loops over heavy wooden rollers. The horses, stamping and neighing, were tethered into place by a web of leather harnessing. Eric stared at this arrangement and scratched his head. "I admit to being baffled, Slan. How can horses draw the turtle if they themselves are carried within it?" Kotsa laughed and patted the nose of one of the huge animals. "You will see, my friend." The warhorse peered at him with contempt, and after a few moments the Slan shied away. Now provisions were lugged into the turtle. Lamp grease, furs, tight bales of hay, Kotsa's trunk, food, and skins of water. Eric noticed the Slan's heavy bath being dragged from the boats. The irreverent Norseman fixed a longboat's dragon head to the box-like turtle. Its wooden eyes peered into the mists of the waste. At last, Eric took his place with the Slan inside the machine. The last plates were stapled into place. The molten iron caulking filled the turtle with smoke. Eric coughed until Kotsa produced a ring of gold about a foot across, which he affixed to an overhead beam. A cool breeze played out of the ring and over Eric's face. He watched wisps of smoke disappear out of the ring. "Just a little gimmick," Kotsa murmured. Now the Arctic daylight was shut out. Kotsa and Eric lit grease lamps and suspended them around the cabin. In the lamps' yellow light, the turtle seemed in an absurdly cozy place. The hulking horses reduced to fireside pets. 3 heavy bangs on the shell. Bjorn, Eric realized, signaling that all was finished. Kotsa opened his mouth wide. "It begins. Now, Eric, the horses." He handed a bemused Eric a heavy crop, and together they began to work the horses. The beasts neighed and dipped their heads, but at last their huge hooves began to move, pulling at the leather belts. With a sudden jolt, the turtle lurched forward. "You see it now," Kotsa cried. The horses dragged the belts, and the belts dragged the turtle, inch by inch to our prize. Eric heard a cheer from the watching Norseman. He made out Bjorn's muffled voice. "I will wait for you here, my mysterious friend. Bring me back a Slanesh love demon." There was ribald laughter. Excitement growing in him, Eric urged the horses harder. With the sunlight glittering from its enchanted shell, the turtle began to crawl northwards. The war horses worked tirelessly, apparently not needing sleep. As he fed them, Eric patted their great muzzles and talked to them seriously. Kotsa took a disc from his trunk. He showed it to Eric. It was polished and black, about the size of a dinner plate. The disc was obsidian. It bore a dim representation of a landscape, of piles of gray ice. The picture looked to Eric like an etching, of a drawn thing of lines and shading. Then Kotsa wiped off the picture with a sleeve and returned the disc to Eric, grinning. The picture slowly redrew itself. It reminded Eric of watching frost gather on glass, but the view it showed was slightly changed, as if drawn from a different place. "An obsidian mirror," the Slan explained, "as used by the great Emperor Mazdamundi to study his empires, as if through the eyes of a flying bird. It will serve as a window in the wall of our turtle." Eric peered into the murky plate. Silently, he promised himself that if it ever looked as though they were about to drive into a crevasse, he'd kick a hole in the damn wall and see for himself. Kulza spread his map over the turtle's floor and squatted over it, legs folded under him. He pored it over the map, comparing details with what he saw in his disc. He used his mirror and map to pick a way through the jumbled landscape. If he wanted to steer the turtle, he would goad one team of horses harder. The turtle would swing about with a teeth-jangling scrape. The polar cold lanced through the thin metal of the turtle's shell. Eric hung furs over the inside surface of the shell. The furs trapped the horse's body heat, and the temperature became tolerable. Kulza had Eric set up his metal bath and light a small fire below it. Steam filled the turtle. The horses snorted complainingly and tossed their heads, to Eric's disgust. Kulza discarded his suit of tubes and stripped to his yellow-gray skin. He squatted happily in the water, his nostrils poking above the surface. Eric spent long hours working at his muscles, keeping them hard and fast, or resting with his back to the wall of mithril armor. When he slept, he wore his weapons. As they headed north, the sun disappeared from the sky. When the obsidian plate was turned towards the wastes, the sky turned into a thing of whorls and jagged lines. The war horses snorted, their huge legs working. Eric started awake. The turtle rocked, swaying like a drunkard as it crawled on its way. The slan sat in his bath. He clung to its sides with widespread, webbed fingers. His eyes were fixed on Eric. What is it? Eric pressed his ear to the metal wall. He heard voices, like girls laughing teasingly, receding from and approaching the mithril. And there were scents like fine perfumes. He felt blood pool in his loins. I would guess it is a welcoming party from Slaanesh, said Eric dryly, the pleasure lord of darkness. He stood, rested lightly on the balls of his feet. He relaxed the strapping around his battle axe. The heady laughter whirled around the turtle. Eric's imagination showed him the demonettes of Slaanesh. Their stigmata, the single right breast, the green eyes, and their unbearable beauty, and all the while the subtle sense probed at his mind, stirring his thoughts. There was a pounding on the shell. It was as if a huge fist were beating against the metal. Kulza screamed. The turtle shook. The warhorses stumbled. Their leader raised his muzzle to the roof and growled like a cat. And now came another sound, a whirring, a grinding against the metal like a knife sharpener's stone. Kulza whimpered. That's a chainsword. They're trying to cut their way in. Eric stared up at the armor. He grabbed a grease lamp and held it to the roof, inspecting the seams. "It's holding," he breathed. "For how long?" the Slan cried. He wrapped his huge face in his hands. "Your eagle warrior courage is comforting," spat Eric. Kotza stared up at the shuddering roof. "What, by the Emperor's teeth, are they?" "Demonettes, probably," Eric said, recalling old battles. "They fight as if insane. Perhaps there are warriors of chaos, humans who have sold their souls to the Pleasure Lord." At that, Kotza's huge eyes flicked away from Eric's face. His mouth worked and his hands spread once more over the rim of his bath. Eric noticed the sudden reticence. Now what did that mean? What was his dubious ally hiding? The pounding, the grinding went on, and unceasing, but without breaching the mithril. When he was satisfied of that, Eric resumed his seat and closed his eyes. Eric had survived many a battle. He didn't let the hammering of Slaanesh demons, the whimpering of a mysterious Slan, stop a light from stealing over him, but he kept his weapons to hand. The days in the swaying turtle turned to a blur of noise. Eric chewed meals of dry meat. His dreams were filled with smiling women. Their cheeks bore a soft down, and their eyes were green. Kotza moaned continuously. He stirred in his bath, lost in his own erotic nightmares. Then it stopped. The turtle rocked to stability. The horses stumbled at the suddenness of it, then found their feet. The belts whirred once more over their rollers. Kotza sat bolt upright in his bath. His skin was gray, slick with slime. Bones showed through limp flesh. "It's over," he whispered. "We're out of the reach of Slaanesh." "I'm sure we'd be welcome back," Eric said. "So we're safe." The mithril worked. Slan's long legs flexed. Then he reached into a pile of supplies and drew out a handful of dried cockroaches. Greedily, he shoved the insects into his wide mouth. Eric watched in disgust. The scents of Slaanesh were gone, but his memories populated the silence outside with other servants of chaos, with an infinite arsenal of silent death. Kotza feasted. Eric kept his hands on his weapons. The passage became smooth, ominously so, Eric thought. The days passed rapidly. It grew hot. Sweat steamed from the horses. Eric discarded his furs. He stood beneath the Slan's air-breathing ring. A breeze still rustled out of it, but for some reason, it didn't refresh him. He wiped sweat from his face, sat again, and tried to rest. Even the Slan complained. "Why should it be so hot?" he whined. "It should get colder as we go further north, not hotter." Eric smiled. "I told you, don't expect experience to be a guide. Not here. Take what comes and fight it." The obsidian mirror showed a land of darkness. Kotza held it to the roof and tried to guide their progress by the stars. Suddenly, he screamed. Eric jerked awake and reached for his weapons, and was slammed backwards by a punch in the chest. It could have come from the fist of that Kislevite giant. He felt the wooden floor splinter under him. He struggled to his feet. There was nothing to see in the flickering light of the grease lamps, but something was smashing its way around the turtle like an invisible bird. Heaps of supplies were blasted open and scattered around the cabin. The horses reared, their harnesses snapped. Kotza was picked up bodily, tubes dangling, and slammed face first against the ceiling. Then he was dropped with a splash into his bath. Norseman, help me!" The lamps blew out. Now the only light came from the fire under Kotza's bath. "Eric, what is it?" Eric struggled to keep his feet. "It's an elemental, a demon of the air." "Our armor is breached." "No." The elemental shoved past him. He felt a meaty slap to the face. "It's your breathing ring, Slan. It's got in that way, bit by bit. And we're doomed." "What?" Eric staggered to the bath and grabbed the Slan's shoulders. "What the hell are you talking about, Kotza? You Slan are supposed to be great wizards. Use magic. Fight it off with a spell." The Slan struggled out of his grasp and curled into a ball. "I can't," he moaned. "I have no magic." "Save us, Norseman." Eric stared at him, unbelieving. Then the elemental hit him in the back and knocked him flat on his face. The creature pounded at his spine, roaring like a gale. Eric grinned his teeth, arms trembling. He howled, arched his back, pushed the hard pads of his paw hand into the floor. The fur on his face stood erect. For a few seconds, Ware fought Elemental. Then the demon slithered from his back. Eric struggled to his feet, fighting the impulse to snap and howl. He had to control the Ware. Think clearly. Find a way to drive out the Elemental. Kotza's fire. Eric grabbed the rim of the metal bath and pulled it off the fire, tipping out the wailing Slann. Then he rummaged through their piles of supplies until he found a block of lamp grease. He pulled the sticky stuff apart and flung it at the fire. Flame roared up. Heat blasted into his face. The Ware flinched. The man stood his ground. The Slann scurried into a corner. Smoke poured through the cabin, making Eric's eyes sting. The horses stamped in complaint. Eric hurled more grease into the blaze. Hot air blasted up. The atmosphere became a massive smoke and turbulence. It was as if a second elemental had been released into the cabin, but this one was controlled by Eric. The elemental snapped at his legs and back. Eric slammed it into the walls, but it was weaker. Eric grinned, wiping soot from his face. As he'd hoped, the elemental was beginning to lose its cohesion in the disrupted air. There was a wail that filled the cabin. Then air began to rush out of the breathing ring. In a few seconds, it was over. The fire burned steadily now. Eric, coughing, began to relight the lamps. He found Kotza buried in a pile of furs. Eric poked with one booted foot. "Come out," he said. "It's over." The Slann uncovered one eye. "Take down your breathing ring," Eric growled. "It was the only breach in our defense, and it almost killed us. But we'll suffocate. Keep it down until we have to, understand? Now help me fix this damn mess." He walked to the warhorses and began to calm them with firm words. Kotza hissed like a snake. Eric started awake. Painfully, he pulled himself to his feet, his head pounded. In the days since they closed off the feed, the air in the turtle had become thick and stinking. Automatically, he looked to the horses. The huge beasts labored at their treadmills, their coats matted with sweat. The Slann was hunched over his obsidian device. His lips popped together, mouthing words unknown to Eric. Then he said quietly, "Eric, we have succeeded." Eric strode through the swaying cabin and snatched up the plate. It showed the usual murky scene, a sky of loops and whirls over a formless land, but there was something new, a sharp image about the size of Eric's thumb. "It's the starboat," breathed Kotza. "See how clear it is? It was designed to travel to other worlds, and so it has survived the centuries of degradation in this forsaken place. It shines in that plate like a pearl in mud." The starboat was a spindle, its prow and stern trailing to needle-fine points. Eric judged the boat to be about 5 times the length of the turtle, perhaps 100 paces in all. He could see no sails, no oars. "I can't see any clinkering," he said, "and it seems to be closed all around. More like a house than a boat. Why should that be?" "How should I know? Why would you roof over a boat? Suppose it was to move underwater as well as over it." Eric shook his head. "Or," said Kotza, "instead of keeping something out, the closed hull was to keep something in." "Like what?" Eric said. "Air? Suppose the ocean this boat sailed it is as empty of air as the air is empty of water." "That's crazy." Kotza laughed. "The ways of the ancient Slann aren't going to be comprehensible to us for a long time, perhaps not ever." He took back his obsidian plate and wiped it over. The boat's image began to slip below them. Kotza had to tilt the obsidian to trace it. "We're passing over the boat," he said. "It's buried in the ice." "We're nearly over it." Eric hurried to the horses and pulled at their bridles. The turtle shuddered to a halt. Eric gathered armfuls of hay and scattered them at the feet of the panting animals. Kotza scampered over the floor of the turtle, scanning the buried boat with his obsidian plate and making crude sketches on parchment. He showed Eric glimpses of detail, plates of buckled metal, panels covered with obscure rectangular designs. "What a treasure," he crooned. "Don't get excited, Slann. We haven't worked out how to reach it yet." Kotza snorted and continued his study. At last he spread out the results of his labors. It was like a sketch map of the starboat. "Here," he said, tapping with a thumb. "See how the plates are breached, torn apart? There's a hole wide enough to let a man in, even one as broad as you, Norseman," he added jovially. Eric studied the map, then paced around the turtle. At length, he selected a spot and cleared away clutter from the floor. "The hole's here yet," he said. "Yes," the Slan nodded excitedly. He stood and clambered into a purple cloak. "Well, Eric, let's see this boat for ourselves." Eric touched his weapons. He felt reluctant to breach the protecting mithril shell. But he'd come a long way for this, and you can only die once. He grinned fiercely, raised one booted leg, and stamped down on the deck. The wooden flooring splintered and broke up. Then his boot reached the clinkered armor beneath. Iron seals cracked and fractured. Soon 2 plates were loose enough to prise aside. "That's enough," Eric growled, lifting the loosened plates. "Let's keep the breach small." Ice gleamed dully in the hole. Eric probed at it with one finger, and jumped back with a yell as ice flashed to steam. The Slan laughed. "The normal rules don't work here, remember?" he taunted. Eric glared, then with the butt of his battle axe pushed at the popping ice until it had all vaporized. Tendrils of steam filled the cabin. The Slan sniffed contentedly. Under the ice, the earth was grayish and dead, like fine sand. Eric used the blade of his axe to scoop it out. Then his blade clanged on something hard, metallic. Eric looked up. The Slan stared into the hole, tongue wriggling out of his lips. Eric bent into the hole. Eric bent into the hole and brushed away the remaining layer of dirt. The hull metal of the star boat gleamed like polished bronze. The Slan sat beside Eric and touched it in awe. "It's perfect, after so many thousands of years," he whispered. "But look how it's crumpled." Eric searched the dirt until he reached the breach into the hull. The last few grains of earth fell into a circular patch of darkness. It was about an arm's length wide. Eric stared into it, saw nothing. "Give me a lantern." Kotza brought him a simple candle in a clay bowl. Eric lowered it cautiously into the boat. The flame flickered but burnt on. "So the air's not foul," Kotza hissed. Eric made out a floor of metal, perhaps 10 feet below him. He looked up at Kotza and shrugged. "We can't learn anything from out here. I'm going in." "Let me hold the lamp." After checking his weapons, Eric swung his feet into the hole. His waist passed through easily, his axe bumping against the lip of the hole. Then he lowered his body until he was dangling from his fingertips. He let go. His feet hit the metal with a soft thud. He landed at a battle crouch, sword in hand. Silence. Darkness. Broken only by a disk of yellow lamplight above his head. The Slan's silhouetted head appeared. "Eric?" "I'm safe. There's nothing here. Give me the lamp." The Slan's bony arm extended into the boat. Eric reached up, took the lamp, turned with the light in his hand. A white face loomed at him, jaws wide and gaping. Eric yelled. He grasped his sword and smashed again. "Norseman, what's happening?" Eric stepped back, breathing hard. There was a chair before him, large and fine enough to be a throne. Now it was covered by fragments of smashed bone. Bone dust drifted in the musty air. "Nothing," Eric said. "There's no danger. It was a skeleton. A thing of bones in the seat, facing me." The Slan nodded. The Slan's nodding head reappeared in the hole. Eric laid his lamp on the floor, then reached into the chair and pulled out a shard of a skull. The head had been large, flat. "What do you think it was?" "Slan," said Kotza. "Just like a modern skull, perhaps a little larger, a little finer. No doubt we've coarsened since our fall. I think that was a sailor, Eric. A Slan who took this boat to the stars and who died when the boat plowed into the ice." Kotza dangled his flippered feet into the hole and dropped through. Eric raised the lantern and began to explore. They were in a sharp-edged box about as large as the turtle. Eric looked close but could see no joints between the wall plates. Another skeleton, intact, sat before a table. The table was encrusted with buttons and slivers of glass. The chair held a pool of dust, perhaps the residue of the Slan's flesh. Shreds of some ancient material clung to the wide rib cage. A spindle the size of Eric's fist hung in the air above the table. Eric looked for wires suspending it, but could see none. "Look at this," he said. "It's like a toy version of the boat, a model." Kotz appeared, poked with a tentative thumb. There was a spark where he touched, a crack like gunpowder cap. The Slan leapt back. The little model rocked in the air, and the starboat groaned and shifted around them, like a bear stirring in its sleep. Kotza looked about fearfully. Eric heard himself growl. The model came to rest. The groaning ceased. Kotza looked at Eric. You know what this is, don't you? What? It's for controlling the boat. It's like a rudder. Yes, a rudder. Move the toy and you move the boat. See? Some races have spells which work on the same principle. Eric peered doubtfully at the model. Well, it's like no rudder I've ever seen. Kotza approached one wall. It was coated with panels of dark glass. Below each panel was a plate covered with a close, unrecognizable script. Obviously, this room is only a small part of the boat, murmured the Slan. So what's in the rest? Kotza shrugged. Maybe the sails, or whatever it was they used to drive the boat. He pushed his broad muzzle close to the black glass. This stuff is obsidian. Come and look. There's a picture in the obsidian plate. Eric saw stars and something round and shining. The world? The Slan said. I think we're seeing what the sailors saw on this boat's last voyage, Eric. It's true. The boat really did travel between worlds. So maybe this cabin is a kind of observation post, Eric mused. Like a lookout post in the rigging of a longboat. The Slan nodded absently. His black tongue shot out and licked wide lips. I believe there's more obsidian in the single room than in the whole of Lustria. He reached up his right hand. Kotza, don't touch anything. Remember the rudder thing. There might be some kind of protection. I'm a Slan, Norseman, Kotza said haughtily. This is my heritage. If we can get this obsidian loose, it alone will make me richer than I could have dreamed, and who knows what else we'll find. The Slan peeled off his right glove and spread webbed fingers. Kotza, don't! Kotza touched obsidian, the cabin filled with fire and thunder. Eric was hurled against a bulkhead. He felt the skin of his face blister in the sudden heat. His nostrils filled with the scent of scorching. His hair, beard, clothes. The red glare faded. The noise echoed to stillness. Coughing, wiping tears from dazzled eyes, Eric struggled to his feet. His weapons were in his hands. Good. He looked around quickly. The grease lamp had blown out, but blood-colored light leaked from the plate Kotza had touched. Above Eric's head, he could see a hole leading out into the turtle, and beyond that, he could see stars. So the explosion had breached the mithril. They were naked to chaos. A despair closed around his heart. He shook his head, one thing at a time. He looked for Kotza. The Slan was crumpled into one corner like a wad of rag. He was staring in disbelief at his right arm. It ended in a stump, a few inches below the elbow. Thick blood pumped like a dismal fountain. Eric had seen such injuries before. He had seconds to save the Slan. He grabbed the edge of the Slan's robe and tore away a strip. He wrapped the strip around the stump and twisted until he felt the cloth bite to bone. The blood flow stopped. Then Eric got to his feet and picked up the Slan, boosted him through the roof and back into the turtle. It was like lifting a child. Eric jumped, grabbed the lip of the hole with his fingertips, and hauled himself up. The Slan lay limp on the floor, groaning softly. Eric ignored him, looked quickly around the turtle, weapons to hand. The horses whinnied and stamped. The air in the turtle was cold, damp. A wind like a fist slammed through the breached roof. Eric reached up with one hand and felt around the breach until his fingers closed around a dislodged mithril plate. Soft fingers brushed his wrist. He ground his teeth and hauled the plate over the hole. The wind died to a whisper. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. He kicked something in the debris. It was the spindle, the rudder toy from the starboat. It must have been blown clear in the explosion. He poked it tentatively. There was no reaction. Impulsively, he tucked the little model into his shirt. Now the Slan. Kotza could still die if the wound wasn't treated, and Eric was determined that he would stay alive until he provided some answers. He reached for a handful of grease and slapped it over the nearest lamp. A small fire roared up. Then he knelt and pulled the shattered right arm out from under the amphibian's body. Kotza groaned. Eric stared up at Eric with empty eyes. Eric thrust the damaged arm into the fire. The Slan's scream was unearthly. He struggled feebly. Eric held the arm fast until he could see that all the blood vessels had shriveled closed. He lifted the Slan, who was unconscious at last, into his metal bath and lit the warming fire beneath it. Kotza slept for hours. Eric waited until the watery eyes fluttered open once more. Loops of slime clung to the Slaan's eyelids. He turned his head, looking dimly around the turtle. Then his eyes met Eric's. "You're no Slaan," said Eric quietly. "I suspected when you had no magic to ward off the air elemental. Then there's your character, your greed, your ambition, like no Slaan. And you're a coward. You could never have been an eagle warrior. Now I have proof. That obsidian plate would not have harmed a true Slaan. It's time for the truth. What are you, Kotza?" Kotza dipped his head into the murky water, rubbed at slimy nostrils. Then he said, "I'm human." Kotza told Eric that he had been born of a peasant family in northern Bretonia. He grew to awareness in filth and squalor. Strutting Breton lords ruled the villages with a severity matched only by their corruption and incompetence. Kotza was a weasel-like boy, weak and resentful, despised by his fellows. His only consolation was the tales of the old men of the village. They would recount fantastic legends of lands and times far distant, and Kotza would sit open-mouthed at the edge of their ruminative circles. And most of all, he loved the tales of the old Slaan, with their wonderful machines which could spit fire and fly through the air. In his dreams, Kotza was a god emperor, studying through obsidian his boundless dominions. Kotza had reached a bitter manhood when, one overcast day, the sergeants of the army of King Charles rode into the local market square. The colors of their helmets' plumage shone out against drab mud walls. The sergeants drew their dandified pistols and gathered the young men, Kotza among them, into a rough platoon. The king, the sergeant said, intended a plundering raid over the border into Stalia. They needed volunteers. 2 men were shot to encourage the rest. Then the peasants were marched away, hands clasped on their heads. So Kotza found himself recruited into the Fyrd, the peasant backup to Charles' professional troops. He was given a crude heraldic design to sew onto his brown shirt, was supplied with a stubby sword and an axe. He found life in the army of the king brutal and unrewarding. He watched officers strut around the battlefields, intriguing against each other and showing off their dazzling standards. Meanwhile, the Fyrd was thrust into battle in great disorganized mobs. Peasants died in mass. Kotza was a coward. He hid, ran, earned the contempt of his fellows, but he survived. There was magic on the battlefield, Kotza learned. While peasants bludgeoned each other in the mud, he watched knights in their enchanted armor ride out and join in battle under magic standards. He saw strange things. A man suffered grievous wounds to the head, yet fought on. For a few seconds, a knight split mysteriously into 2 copies, baffling his opponents. Massive warriors would inexplicably turn, drop their weapons, and run howling from the field. And at the center of it all was a strange figure, a frail-looking old man who could nevertheless walk through a crowded field and have the burliest warrior step aside for him. This was Rufus, a powerful wizard in the pay of the king. His bony face was masked by a florid beard, and he wore a cloak that was stiff with sewn-in runes, shards of bone, bits of shattered blades. Habitually, he carried faded spell scrolls stuffed under his arms. Once he dropped a scroll. It steamed as it lay in the mud. None dared to pick it up for him. Rufus seemed to shimmer as he walked. The aura of power around him was almost tangible. It hurt Kotza to stare too long. King Charles' campaign drew to a muddy close. The ragtaggle army headed back over the Breton border. Kotza thought about returning to the village, to a life of poverty and dirt. They crossed an old battlefield. The rotting bodies of friend and foe filled the air with fetid stench. The army made camp. Kotza, exhausted, spread his threadbare blanket across the ground, lay down and closed his eyes. But sleep would not come. He wriggled on the hard ground, suffering the curses of his comrades. There was something wrong. The ground was warm beneath him. Warm? He waited until the dead of night, and then, by starlight, lifted the blanket and scraped aside the mud. Then he sat back and stared, breathing hard. He had found a spell scroll, dropped and trampled into the dirt, glowing softly like coal burning from within. Someone groaned in their sleep. Kotza hastily packed the earth back over the scroll and lay down again, heart pounding. This was his chance. The next morning he made his way to the ornate tent of Rufus and waited at its entrance until the wizard emerged. Rufus scowled like thunder. The bits of shattered weapons sewn into his cloak, glinted at Kotza like hard eyes. Kotza quailed, but he stood his ground. He told Rufus about the scroll. The wizard asked him to describe it, and as Kotza did so, Rufus's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, and he asked where the scroll was. Blood pounding, Kotza proposed a deal. The wizard mocked his bargaining, eyes burning, but Kotza got his deal. He led Rufus to the scroll. The wizard lifted it reverently from the ground and returned to his tent, nodding slowly as he passed. It took the wizard some days to complete his preparations. Then he sent a messenger to summon Kotza to his tent. Now that the moment was here, fear nearly overwhelmed Kotza, but he pushed himself to his feet and followed the messenger, ignoring the curious stares of his fellow peasants. He entered the gloomy interior of the wizard's tent. The wizard was a vague form in the shadows. On a wooden table lay the stinking corpse of a slan. Kotza whimpered and almost fell. He felt a shaming warmth spread damply down his legs, but under Rufus's direction, he climbed onto the table beside the corpse. It took 3 days. The pain was more than Kotza could bear, almost. Then on the 4th day, he opened new eyes. The world was stained pus yellow. The wizard held up a mirror. A slan face stared back at Kotza. You see? Soldiers, even peasant soldiers, share stories, legends from all over the world, Kotza told Eric. I listened to the tale of elves and dwarves, sifted through the rubbish, searched for grains of truth, sought opportunity. I remembered those boyhood tales. I learned that the slan are the oldest race on the planet. Their powers, though lost, were once the greatest. Then I heard the legend of the starboat. I decided this was my chance. In return for the scroll, the wizard gave me gold, and I asked for him to make me a slan. I would seek out the starboat, take its treasure and power. Eric studied the broken amphibian body without pity. You were so stupid as to desire this? To be a slan? It was my childhood dream, whispered Kotza, a chance to reach the machines of the ancient slan. It was a gamble for the highest stakes, for the chance of power such as no mortal has wielded for 5,000 years. Perhaps the power never to die. But you've lost, Eric snapped. You fooled me. But you couldn't fool the slan machinery, could you? Kotza hung his head, nursing his ruined arm. Eric left him. There was no more to be said. The turtle crawled over the ice like an injured slug. Eric had tightened the horses' harnesses, goaded them into turning their armored belts once more. The horses stamped and complained. They were less willing to work together, and progress was slow. The belts moved with a grind. At least one of the wooden rollers was cracked. Eric decided. He tried to fix loose the mithril plates in the roof and floor, but they rattled and slid, and Eric grimly sensed invisible limbs probing into the breached machine. For the first few days, Kotza guided their way with his map and obsidian, but he grew duller and more apathetic. At last he crawled into a pile of furs, dangling his stump of an arm. The air grew colder. At last, frost began to rime the furs, suspended over the metal walls. Eric rested with his back to the mithril. Behind the wall, he could hear gloating laughter. His own body was a battleground. In his dreams, his hands turned to wolf paws which tore into his human face. He awoke, sweating despite the cold, the fur on his cheeks and hands erect and itching. The grease lamps leaked dim patches of light. The turtle became a place of shadows, sinister and huge, no longer a sanctuary. He approached the horse, thinking to feed them. They reared at him, shouting like huge cats, menacing massive hooves and ragged manes. Eric stumbled back. Something stirred under a heap of dirty furs. Eric poked aside the furs with a booted toe. The thing that had been Kotza blinked up at him. He stank of blood and urine. A few blue feathers still clung to his skin. The fake slan held up his smashed arm. Something was growing out of the stump. It had a tiny face with a mouth that opened and closed. Kotza stared at it emptily. Eric pushed the furs over the degenerating creature and returned to his resting place. For a long time he clutched his arms around his body, trying to stop his trembling. They fell under the sway of Slanesh once more, and once more the fists of nightmare beat at the shell of the turtle. This time the roof buckled. Eric clung to a shuddering wall. The horses roared. The Kotza thing squirmed in his pile of furs, mewling. The turtle was rocked, picked up and dropped. Rollers cracked, and Eric heard the belts grind, the wooden the broken wood to splinters. There was a smell of sawdust. Still, the turtle lurched on, its fraying belt spinning. But now Eric heard a sound at first as soft as a heartbeat, a tumble of hooves that grew to a stampede until at last, with a crash like thunder, one wall of the turtle imploded, mithril plates shattered and ripped. The last of the lamps went out and the turtle teetered once, twice, tipped sideways. Eric tumbled, arms wrapped around his head. Furs and filth and grease rained down over him. He caught a glimpse of a huge wool-covered face, of horns like swords. The turtle was left on its side, its rollers spinning uselessly. With a massive laugh of victory, the Minotaur stomped away across the landscape. Eric pushed the debris from his body and tried to sit up. The riven armor emitted its gloomy light. Remnants of the snapped belts littered the cabin. The warhorses were a dark crowd that fought and bit at their harnesses. Eric heard toughened leather snap like thread. The animals drummed their hooves against the nearest wall until armor plates tumbled like leaves. The horses burst through the wall and galloped away. Eric pushed his way to his feet. Cautiously, he worked his way through the debris to the breached shell and peered out. The turtle lay in a landscape of rocks, a few stunted trees. The sky was a dim gray. There was a scent as if a beautiful woman had passed this way. Nothing moved, and yet Eric sensed inhuman eyes watching, waiting for him. Unprotected, he wouldn't survive more than minutes out here. He needed the mithril. He found a breastplate and helmet among the debris of one wall. He tied on the breastplate with a strip of leather and jammed the helmet on his head, ignoring the scratching of its pig iron rim. He searched for shreds of... He found a breastplate and helmet amongst the debris of one wall. He tied on the breastplate with a strip of leather and jammed the helmet on his head, ignoring the scratching of its pig iron rim. He searched for shreds of drive belt. Strips of mithril still clung to the bits of frayed leather. Eric wrapped the shreds around his limbs. He fashioned crude mittens and boots. He swathed his face with belt material, leaving only slits for his eyes. Then, encased in mithril, axe and sword to hand, and with the rudder toy still lodged inside his shirt, he left the turtle. A kind of slime coated the machine. It dripped like mucus over Eric. The dragon had gone. There were teeth marks in the neck stump. Something called after him. "Eric, help me." And another tiny voice echoed the first mockingly. "Eric, Eric." Kotza was lost. Eric couldn't help him. He didn't look back. Here is an illustration. There we go. There's the Minotaur. And underneath it says, he caught a glimpse of a huge wool-covered face of horns like swords. And that artwork was drawn by Adrian Smith. The land seemed empty of light. It was neither day nor night. At times the horizon seemed impossibly distant, at times absurdly close, as if the world itself were swelling and subsiding, like the chest of a breathing giant. Eric shook his head. He was on the border of the wastes themselves. "The rules don't apply," he growled to himself. He stumbled on. Occasionally, the lid of clouds would break, and Eric could make out the stars. They flickered and waved, as if seen through tears, but they were there. Eric squinted up at them, searching for the North Star. When he found it, he turned his back and limped onwards. South. Always south. Occasionally, he heard rumbling over the horizon, saw flashes of light. The hordes of Slaanesh? Eric ran until his lungs rattled in his chest, away from the terror, but there was no sanctuary. Even at the quietest hour, even in the most lifeless wasteland, ghostly fingers clutched at him, prying and probing. He would whirl, weapons ready, but there was nothing there. They were watching him, biding their time, perhaps arguing over the spoils. He shook his head and stamped onward. He didn't dare sleep. He knew that if he lost consciousness, he would not be allowed to regain it. The days wore away, and with them his strength. Finally, his knees buckled. He slumped to the ground, pressed face down by the weight of his armor. Dust crept over his legs and buried them. No. From somewhere he found the strength to push himself upright, to drag his calves from the malevolent dirt. Then, with a howl of defiance, he drove one foot ahead of the other. His howl had been a wolf's, he realized. He dug his fingers into palms that seemed thicker, more padded than before. All his life he had battled to retain his humanity. Only on the battlefield had he used his werepower. But now his human strength was draining, and the wolf was emerging. Would he die an animal, his mind full of blood and death? Eyes half closed, body crusted with scraps of mithril, Eric the Were stumbled on through the deadly landscape. Dimly, he noticed that the land was changing. The trees disappeared, and the dust was replaced by a surface that was smooth and yielding. A coarse black grass sprouted from the pitted ground. A tuft of grass wrapped itself around Eric's foot. He clattered to the ground. The earth was warm, body hot. With his ear to the surface, Eric could hear a thumping, like a huge heartbeat. Groggy, disgusted, he turned to rise, pushed himself away from this ground of flesh, but strands of the black-haired grass wrapped themselves around his ankles and wrists, pinning him. A face pushed out of the epidermis beneath him, a human face, the face of a boy. Fur sprouted over high cheekbones. The boy cried and stared into Eric's eyes. "Eric," he said softly. "Eric." Eric struggled against the thongs of hair. The tortured face was his own as a child. Now there was a soft growling. The face was lengthening. Whiskers sprouted from the stretching muzzle, and a wide mouth grinned, filled with razor teeth. It was the face of a wolf, a female. She licked her lips, flicked her pink tongue at him, her body thrust out of the epidermis, wriggling against his. The body was a human woman's. Eric barked softly, aroused. His armor was in the way. He began to shrug it aside. The lithe body of a female moved beneath him. "No!" His voice was a growl. He ripped free one arm and touched his face. There was a suggestion of a muzzle. The bones of his jaw ached unendurably, as if they were being stretched. "No, no, no." The human words seemed to cut through his hot, muddled thoughts. He pulled free his limbs. The hair grass ripped out by the root. The land bled. He stood erect, breathing hard. It was an effort to keep his balance, not to drop to all fours. The wolf face laughed at him. The body writhed. But now Eric could see that the eyes were green, and the body had a single right breast. The stigmata of Slanesh. Laughing, the demon sank once more beneath the surface. There was a snorting, a clattering of hooves behind him. Eric whirled around. The war horses. They ran towards him in a mist of sweat and saliva. Their hooves left little bloody craters in the living earth. Sudden hope filled him. If he could mount one of them. The horses drew closer, still packed together. Now he could see how the heads and limbs of the horses thrust at random out of the herd. Nostrils flared and eyes rolled as the dozen heads snapped and bit at each other. Legs clattered at random into the ground, some broken and dangling. Eric's hopes evaporated. He clutched his sword, braced his legs. This was no ally of Eric's. The herd was a single creature, a bag of dark skin out of which protruded the remnants of the war horses. The horse thing was a chimera, a monster of darkness. The chimera struggled to a halt just before Eric. The nearer horses tried to rear, and 20 hooves waved at the Norseman. Eric faced it, sword and axe held ready. There was a bulge in the sack of flesh, a reptilian face thrust out toward him, a wide mouth open, 2 arms pushed out, beseeching. "Eric," the voice was muffled, "for pity's sake, I am still alive and sane inside this thing. Help me." "Kotsa." The horse thing reared ahead again and advanced, looming over him, and now a face erupted out of the right arm of the buried Kotsa thing, a tiny caricature of Kotsa's. "Eric," it hissed. "Eric," it lunged at his throat, snapping like a snake. Eric smashed at it with his axe. Kotsa wailed in agony. A hoof caught Eric's chest. Armor spun away, gleaming. More hooves rattled over his head, his back. He lost his axe. He went down, arms over his head. Under the flailing hooves, the living ground turned to a bloody pulp. There was a smell of urine and sweat. He reached deep inside himself, sought all the were strength in his being, and unleashed it. With a howl that was at once wolf and human, he rose to his feet and stabbed at the thing above him, thrusting again and again. There was blood and dirt and pain. Eric crawled away, slumped to the ground, looked back. The chimera still raged, but it was being held from him, pushed back by a dark shape that howled and leapt. Shining teeth ripped throats and gouged eyes. It was a wolf. For 1 second it looked at Eric with a kind of understanding, then it turned, scrambled onto the multiple backs of the roaring chimera, and fought on. Eric struggled to his feet, pulled his tattered armor around him, and staggered away. The land turned to dust again. The ice crunched beneath his feet. Eric shivered with the renewed cold, but he rejoiced. It was a natural cold, a sign that he was leaving the shadow of the wastes. Day and night resumed their cycle. The stars no longer wavered. Eric dared to sleep, huddled in a blanket of snow. He reached an empty coast. The frozen sand crackled. A single longboat remained. Bjorn saw him approach, hailed him, came running from the little camp to greet him, and hesitated a few paces away. "Eric?" he asked doubtfully. Eric opened his mouth, then licked his lips, worked his stiff tongue, and tried again. "Bjorn, what is it?" "So it is you," the Norse overseer said wonderingly. "But you've changed." He took Eric's arm and led him to the edge of the sea, bade him stare at his own reflection in a sheet of ice. Eric saw a smooth face, a thin tangle of beard, cheekbones that were low and free of fur. The mark of the wolf had gone. Eric looked back to the northern shadow, to where his despised were-half had remained to save him from the chimera. Perhaps it fought on even now. "Come on," Bjorn said, wrapping an arm around Eric. "Let's get you to the camp. We've got stew and mead, and we'll set off for Norska in the morning. I'll bet you've got quite a story to tell." Norska. He would return as a hero, and fully human. No longer Eric the Were, Eric the Man. Inside his shirt, he could feel the slim form of the model star boat warm against his skin. A toy for his son one day. Life stretched ahead of him like a sunlit room. "Yes," he told Bjorn. "Quite a story." Alright. So that was The Starboat. That was quite a tale. Quite a tale. And you can see how Warhammer Fantasy was tied into 40K back then. Oh. Alright, next week we will have The Ignorant Armies by Jack Yeovil, which is the title of the book. So that should be fun. That is the last story, I believe, in here. No. Looks like there's another one. And then there's 2 more in the front that I read before recording, which I may go and reread for the recording if people want. Well, thank you for joining me, and thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll come back later. Bye-bye.